Thank you very much for the introduction, Charlie. Your list of criteria is now scary for me. Outstanding scholars, and I'm supposed to inspire you, so I will, that's a heavy weight on a very cold Vienna Tuesday afternoon. I'll try my best. I wanted to thank Vanessa Hanneschläger. I had coaching on how to pronounce the name, for originally inviting me to speak in this series, and Charlie as well for welcoming me along, and then Daniela Fasching for all of the organizational work to make it happen. So thanks very much. I'm very excited to be here. I've never been to Vienna before. I'm hoping I will get around and see some of it before I leave tomorrow. So very pleased to be here. You've had a mini bio. The academic background is truly that. It is a background in the sense that I've now been 6 years working in the repository community, so I've really shifted into that realm. I had never really intended it. I kind of came about it, as many of us do, through a path that was linked to technology and digital engagement with my students and as a lecturer. I always had a kind of interest in that. I found it fun. And then fun turned into an entirely different career path in a different country. I don't know, it's always hard to understand people's accents if you're not a native English speaker, but mine is Canadian, and I live in Ireland. It's dangerous to be considered American right now, so I'll, have to edit that out of the video. Okay, so as Charlie said, I'm the director of the Digital Repository of Ireland. So we are a multi-partner institution in Ireland, and we are headquartered at the Royal Irish Academy, where I am based. We have a remit that covers humanities and social sciences data. That's the kind of academic term. Depending on the context, we'll say social and cultural data, because our depositors come from the higher education community, but they also come from cultural institutions and in some cases also government agencies that produce social and cultural data. We're involved in a wide variety of initiatives in Ireland and internationally, but today I'm going to focus mostly on cultural heritage and work that we've done with digital cultural heritage and the preservation of that. Because our core work really is as a preservation repository, but that sounds like a rather technical thing, and to me, the fun then starts with what you can do with the material that you've preserved in that repository. So I would say, given the venue for the talk tonight, that our work sort of falls broadly in the realm of digital humanities, but not squarely in that realm. I would say that a better fitting term of what I'm going to talk about tonight is probably public humanities or public history with a focus on the digital. This is a very fine distinction in some ways, but I think it suffices as an introduction. We can debate it later, because I've learned that digital humanities scholars, one of their favorite things to do is debate what digital humanities is, so you can start that at the end. I hear enough laughter in the room to know that that hits home. Okay. So I've been thinking about this concept of digital cultural heritage while preparing this talk. And earlier this autumn, I found myself at the Museum of Natural History in Oxford. This is a stunning old building surrounded by beautiful, lush English gardens, a huge lawn in front, very smart-looking, rather privileged students all over. Gorgeous place to be. And it has several floors with a balcony that overlooks huge dinosaur bones below. The building is full of light. It has lots of children running around really enthusiastically asking their parents a million questions, trying to engage with all the exhibits. In other words, this museum feels very full of life. It's teeming with a kind of energy, light, children, etc. And I think that's really ironic, given that it is a museum dedicated to conserving a lot of very dead things. Okay. So from several angles, it appears that you are in a massive taxidermy shop, stuffed animals everywhere, furry creatures looking out at you with a kind of funny eye, bugs pinned colorfully in rows behind glass display cases. I took a moment to kind of survey this, of course, on the coffee breaks, because I was at a conference, which is coming up. I took a moment to say hello to some of the inhabitants. But the real reason that I was at this museum is because it was the chosen setting for the annual PASIG conference. PASIG has a kind of terrible name in some ways. It's the Preservation and Archiving Special Interest Group, which makes it sound like it takes place in kind of a small room of a dark alley in some obscure building. But in fact, it is one of the key conferences dedicated to the topic of digital preservation in all of its glory. And it's been around for a while. And I'm going to offer a brief definition of digital preservation to get us started, but I'll go into more detail on that. So for now, I will say that digital preservation is the process, and this will come up in a slide, because there are students in the room, right? There are students of a course, right? So you can write it down later. It's the process of actively managing digital content over time so that it can still be accessible in the future. And when I say digital content, it's not very complicated. You might think of that as a file on your computer, the pictures that you take on your camera, most of your cameras. If some of you are still carting around a non-digital camera, I applaud you and your efforts to get those pictures printed. So the conference attracts delegates from around the world, from industry, from academia, from libraries, from IT departments, and from all different kinds of domains. And the topics addressed, as they overlap with digital preservation, are very wide. I was on the program committee for this conference this year, so I had the good fortune to invite a couple of speakers. And to give you a sense of how broad, like how many different kinds of people are interested in digital preservation, the two that I invited, one was a radio presenter for the BBC, and the other runs the data repository at CERN, so the repository that collects insane amounts of data continually every second that come out of the Large Hadron Collider. So these two are worlds apart, but their interest overlap when it comes to the consideration, or the considered preservation, I should say, of digital objects. So here we all were at this conference on digital preservation, surrounded, just picture, you've seen some of the pictures, by the centuries-long effort of material preservation, or as people in the archives and museum sector would call it, conservation. I think it was a very cheeky but very clever location to choose for a conference on digital preservation. So archives, museums, galleries, libraries, the GLAM sector as it's been acronymed, have a long history of collecting, curating, conserving objects that reflect a given culture's history and heritage. Museums have all sorts of controls in place, a lot of it taking place behind the scenes, to take care of these artifacts that are in their care, to steward these objects over time, to ensure their safe existence and their security in place. And most of us who have been to a museum have some sense of that. We're vaguely aware that it's important to save stuff if we want to have an idea of our culture and our history over time. And we may have some sense of the challenges of that. So for example, unless you're one of the very tiny children that think the dinosaur might be real, which is also exciting, we're aware that this skeleton probably has things, it probably uses things to keep the bones stuck together, that it didn't just emerge out of the ground looking like this. And also there are procedures to make sure that it doesn't disintegrate and fall on somebody's head over time, anything like that in the museum. So significant research goes into the methods for conservation and restoration to try and present objects in their best light before the harshness of climate, of human history has altered them. And we could have lots of debates about how things should be preserved and if we should leave ruins intact or rebuild them, but I'm not going to do that today because that's really not my domain. But there have been some interesting discussions about this happening online, and just as I was preparing this a few days ago, this popped up on the internet. You can find a kind of article in, the citation is there in an online magazine about this. So if you take a look at this tweet by the art conservator Philip Mould, that is his name, I think. It's a funny name because he is talking about trying to take care of old paintings. But what it says here is what the mysterious 400-year-old Prince Henry looked like before with cleaning tests and after cleaning. Mastic varnish, which is made from tree resin, biodegrades and turns yellow or brown over time and can almost completely hide a painting if left long enough. So in this case, the removal of this once protective varnish revealed the true colors of the painting. And this was an effort to restore something and see what it originally looked like. And colors can have, as we know, significance and meaning, so that's relevant. New technologies have also been applied to reveal what may or may not be revealed to the human eye. So we're getting kind of the emergence of the digital into this realm of the material. So here's the next tweet in his series, and it's a lot of fun to read. So he says, X-ray drama, a surface anomaly in the belly area of this important portrait of Admiral Anson. So I don't know if this is a red thing. Oh, yeah. So I certainly can't see the surface anomaly, but this art dealer did. He says, took us to the radiography department of Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. I find that fascinating that they use that. See the next tweet for what we discovered. This guy's really good at social media if you're looking for tips, education and outreach tips on social media. So this is a picture of the X-ray, and if you look back to the belly, right here, and tilt your head upside down, he says, a severed head, who is he? This can only be an abandoned portrait by Reynolds himself. An abandoned canvas, a first idea. It's like, he's got the mystery of what's behind the painting. So this is kind of fascinating what can be done. Okay. So what's interesting about this is it educates the public in the processes involved in conserving and restoring and taking care of these objects, as I'm calling them collectively today, of material culture. And I'm naming them that not with a full sense of the background of that word, but just to kind of distinguish it from digital culture for the time being. So this makes it obvious to us. It may be less obvious what goes into the conservation of other objects, but archivists will know that you can't just, for example, take any random piece of paper, put it in any random box on a random shelf in a random room, and expect that it'll survive over time or that anybody will be able to find it or know what it's about. You don't just store things away. Steps have to be taken to ensure that the material itself is preservable, that the conditions for storage are right, and really importantly, that it's labeled and cataloged so you know where to find it and you know what to do once you have found this thing when you open the box. And if that's called cataloging, in the digital repository realm, it's called metadata. Who's heard of metadata? Yeah, a few people. Okay, most people. Interesting. All right. It's a really hot topic. Archives and metadata are a hot topic right now, which is a lot of fun. I'm glad I fell into this world. So simply storing something is not usually sufficient. Okay. Lots of talk about material culture. We can collectively acknowledge that keeping aging objects is a task that requires care and expertise. But increasingly, our intellectual and creative outputs are born digital. So this is the massive shift that's been taking place for a while, but is happening exponentially now, the growth of digital culture. And as digital humanities scholars, you're well aware of this. So how do we ensure that these outputs, these digital objects, are properly stewarded for future generations to access, to interrogate, and to enjoy? It's more difficult, I've been finding, because this is part of my job, it's more difficult to convince people of the complexity of digital preservation, the need for it, and the importance of getting started on it right away. That we're losing time, we are losing a lot of data all the time. And you can find statistics online, they're like Armageddon type things, 1 billion files lost, or this many bits gone. You can see that around. But there are things happening to help try to stem the tide of this loss. The thing is, we have to preserve digital objects with the same care, the same effort, the same attention as we do with material objects. So this brings us back to the topic of digital preservation. So I'm going to outline what I mean by this, but I'm going to start first, instead of with a definition, with two things that digital preservation is not. Okay? And I just recently wrote a blog with a colleague about this topic because it's hard to get this message across. Okay. Storage is not digital preservation. Okay. So storage, where you store something, is definitely one part of long-term preservation. It's a very important part of long-term preservation, but it does not cover everything that you need to do. So as I mentioned with the example of the piece of paper being put in a random box, you can't properly preserve something by just putting it somewhere and tucking it away and hoping for the best. If you want to read that blog, it's written like a play set at the Oxford Museum with stage directions. This was my random throwback to my theater studies life. But that was an effort to make it fun, because I don't think the topic is very fun. So take a look. Anyway. But this perception persists that if you take a file and back it up to a different hard drive, not just the one you're using now, but some other one, and put it in maybe a safe, even with a combo lock, that you're essentially doing what you need to do to make sure you can access it when you need it. And I think this is a great step. It's very important. Everyone should go home and back up their hard drives tonight. Make that your evening post Digital Humanities Center lecture event. Yeah. You should do that, but it's not enough, and I'm going to explain why. Okay, the second thing that it's not, before I get to, I'm holding back on the explanation here, putting it on the internet is not, I like this laughter. I've already convinced you. Putting it on the internet is not digital preservation. I actually heard someone say this the other day at a conference. It wasn't a digital preservation conference, thankfully, but they said, well, we put it on the internet now, so we know that that's safe, and moved on to the next thing. Okay, I'm not going to go into all the reasons why this is not the case, but it's not digital preservation, and it's not sustained access. Links can break. You can forget to pay your web host. You can move on from whatever host you used. Your web host can move on from you and decide to dump all of your files as they create a new business model. So posting things on the internet is an absolutely excellent way to provide broader access to digital materials. It's definitely something that you should do, and lots of organizations that never were involved in the digital, lots of museums that are good at dealing with really old stuff, have jumped into the new stuff and started to post things online. So it's a very good step towards access and increasing accessibility, but it doesn't take care of the long-term access. Okay, so with these two nots aside, I will move on to what digital preservation is. And I'll give a definition made up of several parts. So we'll suffice with this short definition to say that digital preservation is the active management of digital content over time to ensure its ongoing access. This is the one for the students that I mentioned before without a slide. Active management is really key. Okay, so this is ongoing. Over time is also very key here, and then ongoing access. So you can preserve things really well and not provide access, but then I would say, well, why bother, right? If nobody can ever see it again, is it like if a tree falls in the woods and it's that kind of analogy, right? And nobody's there to hear it. Did it actually fall? I'll just finish that one. In case it's not an analogy outside of English. Okay. So that is one definition to take a look at. Other ways to see it, it's a process. So it's not just a thing. You don't just do it and it's over. It's a process that has to continue over time. It's also a knowledge domain, and that's why there are at least 3 international conferences I can think of that are dedicated to all of these topics. But it's also a community practice. It's something that you kind of have to embed in what you do. And this sounds very big, but there are lots of things out there to help with it, so it shouldn't be terribly stressful. But I like to kind of take that rather dictionary-type definition and change it a bit and say, I think digital preservation is actually about building collections of really amazing content, sharing these collections, and sustaining access to these collections. Because then the purpose seems a little bit more clear. Okay. So why is this process necessary? I will use some illustrations for this next one. Okay, accessing the digital. If you have a book, all you really need to be able to read this is your eyes. Now, I know I'm with humanities scholars, you're going to say, but what language, and is it an ancient version of that language? But let's just assume we can read the book. You need a pair of eyes. Depending on your age, genetics, you might need a pair of glasses and also to read that book. Okay, but to read an e-book, you need your eyes, possibly your glasses. You need something to read it on, a piece of hardware that could be your Kindle, a tablet, a computer, increasingly your phone, especially if you don't need glasses, you can use your phone. And you also need software to render that file on that piece of hardware properly. So our experience of the digital is always mediated, right? It's not possible otherwise. And this situation stands for objects that are material or analog and then have been digitized, or also for objects that are born digital. You still need these kinds of platforms to work with them. Okay, so what's the difference then between backing up your files, storing them somewhere, and the long-term preservation of your files? Okay. So what I would say is that without planned and managed preservation, digital content is at risk. And in fact, one could argue that the risk is much higher than with physical objects, because a very small change to a digital object can render it completely inaccessible. A corruption means you can't open it at all. You can't open just, the left corner of a digital image if the file is actually degraded. Okay, so if we think of fragments of papyrus that are found, right, that analogy doesn't really hold. Anyone who has lost a file or got that awful thing saying we can't open this or deleted something will know how fragile these objects really are. So, and if you think of it this way. If you had just written the most important document of your life, everyone just pause for a second to think of what that is. Past, present, future. You're all going through your CV, research project plans, Horizon 2020 grants, okay? Yeah. And you wanted to make sure that this really, really important document was around for many generations from now. I'm going to put this to the test here, okay? Would you choose to write it on that? Okay. Or would you choose to put it on that? You only get one of the two. Who chooses the 3/4 inch floppy disk? Who's actually seen this before? Yeah, like in real life. Do you have a computer museum around here or something? Okay. There was a really, this isn't a slide, but there was a really fabulous tweet by someone the other day. I don't know if he made it up or if it was real, but he put up a picture of one of these and he said, great, what was I'm going to mess up the joke. It was something like, my 5-year-old son just saw this and said, oh, cool, the save button on Microsoft Word. So you have a real version of the save button lying around in the desk, which was great. Okay. So you should choose the stone tablet. That's the answer. I work in digital preservation, I'll tell you, choose the stone tablet. But of course this is completely ridiculous and untenable because you can't carry this thing on the subway, the metro. You can't bring it to the coffee shop and read it. And the fact is, the more and more cultural objects created, the more and more of our collective knowledge is being built digitally. It's being born digital, so we can't really put it on stones. So we really do have to pay, this is just my hyperbolic way of saying we have to pay extra attention to digital files because they are more fragile. Okay. And now is the techie part of my talk, which isn't terribly techie because I'm not terribly techie, but I will go through a few things. Okay, so why do we have to pay special attention? What is it that we have to pay attention to? So here are a few, this is a very short summary of risks to digital objects, okay? They're fragile, so files can get corrupted. There's a thing called bit rot or bit flip. So you know that files or digital is like ones and zeros, right? If one of those ones flips to a zero, that is bit flip. And suddenly you can't read it in the same way, or the software can't read it in the same way. There are ways to correct this, but you don't want to be practicing that kind of thing over and over again of correcting those flips. Obviously, files are very easy to lose. You can delete them by accident. You can lose your thumb drive. You can leave it on the subway. It's actually probably much easier to forget that than to forget your stone tablet, right? Stone tablet's a little more obvious. Hardware can become damaged. I have a really shocking story. So I had been in this world of digital preservation for maybe about 1.5 years, and I thought to myself, oh, that external hard drive that I brought with me from Canada, I should probably back that up now that I know how easily these things fall apart. In my process of transferring those files to another hard drive. I think I lost, it wasn't terrible, but about 10% of the content because that drive was already failing. Now, fortunately, when I take pictures somewhere, I take about 1,000. So that's, I didn't lose too many pictures. I at least had 8 different versions of the same thing. So, but all jokes aside, that actually happened to me because that hard drive, those hard drives have a kind of maximum lifespan of about 5 years. So you're lucky if you get 5 years. After that, they're going to start to corrupt. So the digital is also, the risks to digital also include the fact that technology changes over time. And the better we get at it, in some ways, the more it's changing. Other things are consolidating, but other things are changing a lot. So there's something called file format obsolescence. For those of you that are on the older side in the room, which definitely includes me by a lot, you may not be able to open up essays that you wrote during earlier degrees that you took in. I can't open up my undergraduate essays now without a kind of plug-in. It's still possible to find that. People create them. But again, as time goes on, this becomes less common. Software and hardware change as well, right? So even if that file format stays the same, the software may change. And is that new version going to accommodate that old format? Over time, we also lose context quite easily. Unless you have properly prepared that digital object, which is an aspect of preservation, and this is where metadata and description comes into play, it may be difficult to know what the provenance of that file was. Is this the authentic version of an image, or has it been doctored? What is there to tell us that it's authentic? You can't carbon date a file. Like, you might be able to carbon date the medium that it's on, but you can't carbon date the file to find out what year it was created in, right? And what is the file? Unless you create context, you may not know what it is. And then also another major challenge is volume. So the digital output is massive and it's increasing, but we all know that. Okay, so these are some of the risks. What are some of the things that we can do? So what are the digital preservation actions that go beyond this first stage of storage, right? So in terms of fragility, you can do something called an integrity check, checksums. So these are kind of technical things that systems can run to see if this bit stream, as we would call a broken down file into its components, if this bit stream is exact to the previous one that was saved. And if there's a problem, then with digital preservation actions, you can restore the previous one. That's one example. LOCKSS is an acronym for lots of copies keep stuff safe. So lots of copies is a good thing. But if you're doing this properly, you want to place those copies in different places so that if one building burns down, you have your backed up storage media somewhere else. Federated storage is another thing that you can achieve when there's different aspects in different places, and storage replacement. How about changing files? Okay, what a trusted long-term preservation repository will do is it will have the ability to do format migration. So if a file is becoming obsolete, if there's no software to support it anymore, or no one is supporting the development of that software, then you can convert those files or migrate them to another format. There's also something called emulation, which I'm going to say this, but there will be people that disagree with me. There's a kind of battle to see, is it going to be migration that wins out in digital preservation or emulation? Emulation is to create an environment on, say, your computer where it can run older versions of software to then be able to look at the files or run the files. That's very complicated. And you can think that doesn't scale so well if different institutions need to use it. But that is another possibility. In terms of the loss of context, what do you do to deal with that? Well, you create really excellent metadata, really excellent descriptions of that object so that it can be found. Descriptive metadata tells you what it is. What's the, say, for example, if it's a book, author, title, what are the subjects, library catalog type information, what are the rights for that material. But then there's also preservation metadata, which can actually identify the provenance of that file, provide means for showing that it's authentic, talk about the actions that were taken on that file. I met someone at another conference recently who works with the United Nations Mechanism for the International Criminal Tribunal, UNMICT. And they have to keep, they have some evidence from war crimes tribunals that they have to keep. Some of it is on failing older media, like, say, VHS tapes, right? So the way to try to make sure they can keep that would be to digitize it. But they have to ensure that that digital version is identical to the other one, because this is evidence in a court of law. Okay? So digital preservation will track the actions that happen on media so you can trace them and know what's happened, and that's really important in some cases. And then in terms of volume, with preservation you can also automate some tasks, you can have preservation policies to help you decide what material should be saved, and appraisal, good old archival appraisal. Should we keep this, should we not keep this? Because we don't need to keep everything, and I think that's really important, although, again, another topic for debate elsewhere. Okay, so these are some of the risks and some of the ways that proper long-term digital preservation addresses those risks. And this is where digital repositories come into play, so I'll just provide you a definition of that. What is a digital repository? It's an infrastructure that provides long-term storage, management, and preservation of digital resources, as well as reliable access to those resources for reuse. So this looks very much like the definition of digital preservation, but it's about the infrastructure in place to do it. And you can be certified, your digital repository can be certified by different external bodies to show that it's actually doing what it's supposed to. And we do have one of those certifications, and we're going for a new one that we should hopefully have in the new year as well at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Okay. So as I said, our remit is around social and cultural data, or social science and humanities data. And we have both born digital objects as well as digitized objects. Okay. So the born digital ones, as I said, are ones that are created originally as digital, as well as ones that have been scanned or photographed to provide surrogates of that original, and they're from many areas across the humanities and social sciences. This is just a little animation of the different kinds of, some of the different kinds of content that we have in the repository right now. Okay, so we know why we have to do digital preservation. We know why files are at risk. So what does digital preservation then enable? What can we do with it once we've saved things? There's a few different things I'm going to say on this. One, obviously, the one I've been kind of drilling into, is that it helps to maintain and provide access over the long term. So that's one key thing. But I would also say that digitization of objects and providing, making sure you save those and provide access to them provides wider access and discoverability via digital means. And that's obvious. You can put something on the internet if you've preserved it, much better that way, and people can see it without having to go to the original. And there's been discussions in the kind of GLAM community about whether this is a good thing to do or not. There's been some concern that if you take a lot of images of, say, paintings in a gallery and put them online, that nobody's going to want to visit your gallery anymore. And research so far shows that it's exactly the opposite. You give people a taste, and they want to go see the original. It's back to Walter Benjamin's idea of the aura of the original. Something is still contained in that material culture that people want to see. And if you give them a taste, they will come to your institution. That's what's been found so far. But the other thing, I think, and I'm going to just give a couple of examples outside of the work that we're doing, is that digitization can help to actually preserve the original. So some archives are digitizing old manuscripts for the express purpose of preserving those fragile pages, to make sure that not as many hands are going to touch them. Now again, of course, if you're doing deep archival work, you may want to see the real thing, but not everyone has to see that real thing. So that's one process that can take place. A couple of more that I find really interesting. This is the SciArc project. It's a not-for-profit, and it's aiming to preserve 500 cultural sites digitally. So what scientists are doing is using advanced 3D scanning technology to digitally document monuments that have been chosen by an international committee. They've mapped 40 sites so far. There may be an update since the last time I looked, but including Babylon, the Titanic, the Sydney Opera House, the Tower of London. Okay. Another similar kind of project is at the Oxford Institute for Digital Archaeology. This again is an international project, and it seeks to document archaeological sites at risk around the Middle East, again using 3D imaging, and then, in some cases, to reconstruct them with 3D printers. And the end goal is to safeguard this region's rich history and cultural heritage from destruction. And this is a very, very real thing, as we all know right now. They have a couple of different projects. You can look at the Million Images database. They've distributed cameras so people can take pictures and send them in. But one that's really important, I think, is that Palmyra's Arc of Triumph, it was destroyed by ISIS in 2015, or at least partly destroyed. And then by the time that area was free of ISIS, the rest of it was gone. But 3D imaging that had been taken has allowed it to be reconstructed. So this right here, it's hard to see, but this is a massive 3D printer creating a stone 1/3 size replica of the Arc of Triumph, and it's gone around on tour, Arc of Triumph on tour. But these are really important things to do, otherwise that heritage can be lost. And the last example I give, this is a very fuzzy slide. That's because of low light and my poor photography skills. But down in the very right corner here, you can see Patricia Sleeman, and this is from her presentation at PASIG, again, surrounded by all of the taxidermied animals. So Patricia works in the archives at the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, another UN body from the one I just mentioned. And the archival work that she is doing is to preserve the record of humanitarian relief and the refugee journey. Okay. So in the case of genocide, war, forced migration, little may be left of cultural heritage without this effort to document it. And she's working again with digital because it's faster, they can preserve it, and she's needs to look at things like the security of that digital archive. Okay, so if we circle back to where we started, I used the preservation of material culture in archives, museums, galleries, libraries as a starting point. But it's clear, I think, that material and digital heritage are already kind of intermingling in different ways. Digital engagement is increasingly permeating our way of interacting. Museums and galleries are promoting digital engagement, as I said before, as part of their strategy. And that could include just releasing images online of their holdings, but they're also providing opportunities for people to engage digitally when they're in the museum. I forget who it is that's doing this, but there's one that has iPads, and you can go around and kind of sketch an art object that you like, and or you can scan it, and it'll tell you other ones in the museum like that. So they're using the ways that we engage in our daily social media saturated lives to get people to engage better with their work. So that's kind of my slightly evangelical talk about digital preservation. I'm going to switch now to the kind of second part and talk a bit about what we've been working on at the Digital Repository of Ireland. So as I said, our core function is a preservation repository, but in the end, the purpose of preservation is access and sharing, I would say. So we've taken on some projects that work on that access side of things, that allow us to work with the digital content in different kinds of ways. And I'll give a couple of examples. Again, I don't think they're really classic digital humanities projects. They're more around digital archiving, the building of digital exhibitions, and about exploring and promoting access to objects through digital means. You may call them DH. Again, that can be for the debate that you're going to have after I finish talking. Okay, so the first example, this is the Inspiring Ireland project. Charlie mentioned it briefly at the beginning. This is a digital cultural heritage platform, and it holds content in its original iteration, because it's had a couple phases. I'll talk about two. The original one is to hold content from 8 of Ireland's national cultural institutions in one common digital portal. It was quite an achievement, I would say, because cooperation in a single digital exhibition across that number of institutions hadn't happened before. And it was really exciting to bring together these kind of diverse types of content into one exhibition. People that that are gallery curators for life, and that's their expertise, will have different things to say about this, because the way we put things together may not be as defensible as exhibitions that are researched over long periods of time. But the purpose was slightly different here. Again, it was trying to get it out there for access. So I'm going to show a video about that. It'll take me a second to... Do we have sound? Yeah, okay. So the process of building this was really interesting and kind of crazy because we did it under fairly intense pressure because the funder wanted it to be released on St. Patrick's Day. And we started it, I think, the December before, which it was about 3 months. So we formed a curation committee. We had representatives from all the institutions that knew their content. We came up with common themes. That sounds really easy, but that was about 10 meetings worth. And we decided to focus on these ones that you saw, sense of place, freedom, and identity, because we wanted to really showcase the objects, and we wanted to reflect a kind of familiar sense of what Irish identity is, but not an entirely cliched one. And that's a very hard kind of thing to balance. But the idea is it should be interesting for people in Ireland and also abroad. So that's what we were trying to, that was the level we were trying to hit. But the idea was to promote a kind of serendipitous discovery. So you would go into the site, possibly looking for something, possibly just trying to check it out, and come across things that you otherwise wouldn't see if you didn't expressly go looking for them across disparate kinds of collections. So to do that, we had to make sure that the metadata was interoperable. The repository supports 4 different standards, and it doesn't matter which one you use. You can search for one thing, and it'll come up across all of them. And we built this exhibition through a website platform called Drupal, which some of you may be familiar with. And as I said, though, putting things on the web is not preservation. So what we did is we used the API, which is the application programming interface. It's a technical thing that allowed that Drupal site to pull the information from the repository. So everything went into the long-term preservation infrastructure first, and then it was pulled out into this curated platform. So this was a way to kind of provide a very pretty, user-friendly, image-forward front end with all the other technical stuff happening in another place. Okay, and the second example, the second example was really actually a new series of exhibitions of a quite different approach on this same Inspiring Ireland platform, with a focus this time on the centenary celebrations of the celebrations of 100 years following 1916, so last year in 2016. Ireland was, every cultural institution was focused on this commemoration year. And it was a very complex thing to commemorate. Very basic history lesson here. In 1916, Ireland basically declared itself a free state from the UK. And it took about 5 years to actually settle that. Many would say it has not been settled yet, and Brexit raises new questions, but we won't go there tonight. So it took a number of years. But 1916 is widely considered to be a very important moment in Irish independence. So it's kind of the biggest celebration that Ireland could have, if I can reduce it to something as simple as that statement. It was very complex because it was quite a bloody event, so there were concerns about how it was commemorated. There was a very heavy use of media, a very rich event schedule, and archives throughout this whole process were really put at the forefront of contemporary cultural activity, because commemorating using images and documents from the past is it's an interesting way to go about it. It had a very strong historical focus. I mean, you could just do lots of marches and parades instead, but in fact, digital archives were used quite heavily, or digitized content. And I think it really gave a clear sense to a lot of people of the importance of preserving for the future. If we want to celebrate this again in another 100 years, it's not about going into the libraries, deep storage to find those documents. We're going to have to keep the digital versions of what we create now. So what this project was about, this was to commemorate using archives, and again, we built exhibitions around different themes on the topic of 1916. And with our project, the primary aim was to commemorate, but we also wanted to complicate the narrative a bit. Women have been heavily underrepresented in the activities of 1916, so we wanted to reinsert that reality back into the historical record. And also, the regions in Ireland, things that took place elsewhere, have also been underrepresented in the historical narrative. So our effort was to kind of complicate that a bit. But what we did with this version of the Inspiring Ireland project is we added a public component. So in the first version, it was the national cultural institutions' existing content. And in this case, we decided to go out and find other kinds of content, again, to complicate the narrative, but I would say also to kind of democratize this writing of history, this digital writing of history. So two things that we did with that. Actually, I would say the main thing that I'll talk about is that we added this element of a public collection day. And this is really what I said before is a kind of public humanities project. And the effort here was to bring in new archival items to add to the collection. And we call this project Weaving Private and Public Narratives. And the effort here was to really question what constitutes an important archival object. We have the ones that people know in museums and galleries. They're better known because they exist and people can see them, but what else exists in private collections that may help to give us a broader understanding? So I'll show you a very short video of what the collection day looked like here. Okay, so the way that we set it up, I don't know if you can see from the video, but we had different stations. So people would bring their physical object in, they would be greeted. This was kind of organized in advance. We had people sign up so we could manage the number of people. And then they would bring the object in and they would be interviewed. And the interview was actually quite long, in most cases almost took an hour. So this is very resource heavy, but exciting. And through that, the metadata that would be created for that object was collected. So all the information that we required to create the descriptive metadata. Then the object was brought down to the digitization station. And then the person that brought it could either go out for a coffee or they could go to one of the other two stations we had set up. So we actually had a conservation specialist from the National Museum in so people could actually find out what they could do with their object if it was disintegrating. So in cases, where the spine is broken, the conservator would say what they could do to hold on to that. And then there was also a researcher from University College Dublin who was very interested in collection days and was interviewing people, a second interview, if they wanted to participate in that. So we made it a kind of fun sort of day. And as you can see, it's branded by the 2016 program because it was funded through this commemoration scheme by the government. And as I said, our first exhibition was on women and the rising. I said we were trying to write back some more lost or undercovered elements into history. And this is what the exhibition looks like when you come to the first page. You can see the women and the rising. When you scroll down, you see the other exhibitions. And then all of the objects that we collected at collection days, some of them were chosen to go into the larger themed exhibitions, but all of them would appear under the collection day side. So people could see their object there and it could be shared. And I'm going to give you just one little example. That's when you go into it. We had expert essayists write kind of overviews of the topic, and then you can drill into the actual object and see the story and see the metadata that was collected at that level. So I'll tell a little bit of an interesting story, because the kinds of things that can happen in this moment are surprising when you're trying to weave together these public and private objects. My team that was building Inspiring Ireland was working on a kind of segment for the Women in the Rising on Grace Gifford, this figure of Grace Gifford. She was a trained artist. She drew a lot of political cartoons, quite heavily engaged in the revolution that was taking place in 1916. And you can't see it, but at the bottom you can see this is actually signed not as Grace Gifford, but as Grace Plunkett. This is important. This was published in 1916, this image, after the Rising. A lot of people died in the Rising, I should mention, if you don't know that part of history. We also had those images in the exhibition, and we had this image of Joseph Plunkett's pistol. So Joseph Plunkett was one of the signatories of this Rising document that stated the freedom of Ireland. Grace Gifford married Joseph Plunkett. This pistol has an inscription to her on it. It says, presented by Joseph Plunkett to Grace Gifford on Easter, Saturday, 1916. Okay, they married in his prison cell the night before he was executed. Okay, so this is what we already had in the exhibition, trying to weave together some of these aspects. And then on our collection day, the video you actually saw them very quickly in the video, along came the Murphy family, like the whole family. They arrived holding this crucifix, you can see it against the blue chair there, as an object that had been passed down through their family. So this crucifix had belonged to a priest, Father Sebastian O'Brien, and this priest had ministered to Joseph Plunkett the night before he was executed. He gave him his last rites. So ostensibly he was holding this cross. The handwriting on the envelope is by Patrick Kennis-Kenny. He was an altar boy in this friary church in Dublin, and Father O'Brien gave this to him eventually as a gift over time. And the guy that got the gift was part of the Murphy family. Okay, so he had passed it down over time. They kept it in this kind of frail envelope with their grandfather's writing on it. So it wasn't just a picture of the crucifix we got, it was actually the inscription on the envelope. And they brought it to us to be digitized. They had no idea that we were working away on an exhibition that would put this particular crucifix in a wider context. They may have known some of the history of that, but not how it may link in with other elements we were building. So I thought this was a particularly fascinating story of the kinds of elements of history you can bring into it. And as I said, we were collecting these digital objects, and we kept talking about digital objects. This is the way we look at them. But the UCD researcher that was there has written up a report on this recently, and she said, I noticed that you guys were always talking about digital objects, but everyone coming into this event was talking about their stories. So what they really wanted to share, and we knew this at some sense, but we were thinking of what's the story that goes around the object, and they're thinking of what's the story, and look at this object that kind of goes with it, right? So interesting inversion. So if the first phase of our Inspiring Ireland project was about bringing together disparate collections from Irish cultural institutions into one portal, then this one, I would say, if I kind of summarize its aims in terms of our work, was about adding items from private collections, complicating the idea of what is an object worthy of commemoration, expanding the voices that contribute to the writing of history. And you can do this with a digital in an easier way than you could with a physical exhibition. They had to bring it in, they got to take their object home at the end of the day, and then we kept the digital version, which they can also keep as well. The last project, I'm coming towards the end here, that I'll discuss is one that we've just started, so I'll be kind of brief on this. And this is a project that is also about providing access to archives that aren't currently available, but also archival enrichment is what I'll call this example. So this is a project with Atlantic Philanthropies. I don't know, is anybody familiar with Atlantic? Every room is different. It's kind of like the entire room or no one in the room knows about Atlantic. This is a no one in the room situation, which just makes sense geographically. This is based in the United States. It's a major philanthropy organization that is now winding down, but Atlantic was a major funder of organizations committed to social progress and human rights. They funded such things as anti-apartheid in South Africa, the peace process in Northern Ireland, many other kinds of huge projects. They donated $8 billion over 35 years to these causes, but 20% of that, which is a very huge proportion for an international organization, was to Irish organizations. Their founder is Irish American, so there is some connection there. And the organizations in Ireland that were funded are civil and human rights groups, the peace process, as I mentioned, health research, huge amounts of funding going into higher education, and building capacity in higher education. So they're a really important organization for the work that they do. And the project that we're doing with them is that we are going to provide a digital version of the Irish grant-making activity, so the business records around the grants that came to Ireland. Okay? But we're not stopping there because we like to do things with archives. What we're doing with this is we are also enriching the archives. It's I would say, a very significant kind of social science project, more about social and political heritage really than specifically cultural heritage, and more recent than some of the other work that we've done. And what we're doing here is we want to add context, add content, add testimonials from people, posters from events, documents that were created by these organizations to help provide a richer idea of what these grants could do. So you'll be able to find the digital archive of the business records, but then we're building exhibitions around that to kind of enhance it. This means that we have the official narrative that you get in the grant documentation, but also other perspectives as well about the work done by those organizations. So again, it's about telling stories. And we're talking about it as telling stories more now that we understand that's clearly what people find interesting. So those are the projects I wanted to discuss. And then just the last slide that I have here is to kind of bring this discussion back into a more strictly academic context, because there's a lot of things that are quite relevant happening around data. Charlie mentioned them at the beginning. He talked about the opens, open access, open science, open source. That's Enriched Archives. I just wanted to mention this organization called the Research Data Alliance, and talk a little bit, just for 2 minutes here, about research data, okay? So research data, we have a very broad definition of this at DRI, and it's something that we are in the process of building greater capacity to support within the repository. We can already preserve it, but we want to work with researchers to provide better kinds of services for them. So research data, very broadly defined, is the inputs and outputs of the research process. So this could be data that you use while conducting your research, or data that you create by the process of your research. And a lot of work is being done right now. The European kind of funding agenda is very focused on the importance of preserving research data so that it can be reused, accessed by other researchers to make for better science, better transparency about the process, and also a growing understanding that if research is publicly funded, then all the products of that research should also be shared and made available to the public. So the Research Data Alliance is the key organization working in this area. We are part of a Horizon 2020 project with them. And there was actually a national event. Was anybody there last week? There was a national event here in Vienna last Thursday, run by the RDA. So there is an effort to build an Austrian wing of the Research Data Alliance. So if you're interested in getting involved, you should take a look, just Google Research Data Alliance. You should consider getting involved. Anyone can join up as a member for free. And what the Research Data Alliance particularly needs is scholars from the humanities, okay? Because other areas of science, sort of natural science or hard science, so-called hard sciences, are further advanced in this area. This, for example, is called the GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. You can see how many records are shared here openly about species data, because species can travel around the world, and this helps to track them. There's also this one. These guys aren't going to win any design awards, but this is the crystallography open database, heavily, heavily used by scientists working in this area to share their data. So Research Data Alliance is about building the bridges, the social and technical bridges, to try to get all domains to find ways to share their data, make it more interoperable, to kind of make for better research activity. So I just thought I'd put that in there because the event just happened, so this is a good moment for you to get into it. And I'm going to end on that note. So I'm happy to, if you have any questions, happy to take a few if there's time. I don't know what the plan is. Thanks.